It was in the second grade when I joined the Cub Scouts, and unlike probably most kids that ever joined, I did so not because of camping trips and hiking and knot tying and all that stuff. The honest truth is that I joined the Cub Scouts because I wanted one of those uniforms. I was kind of like Ernest T. Bass. Have you ever seen that? I wanted that uniform. Anyway, but ultimately that was my motivating factor for joining the Cub Scouts. And I remember I'd been in for, I don't know, a year or two, and at our church at that time, there was a guy. He was a number of years older than me, but he had successfully completed his Eagle Scout. And so at the conclusion of that, there's going to be this Eagle Award ceremony. And at our church, what they did that night was that they took the Sunday night service and they made it this Eagle Award ceremony for Eddie. And we knew that that was coming up that night. And that afternoon, I remember asking my parents about if I should wear my uniform, because I really wanted to wear my uniform. Now, we weren't in the same troop. I mean, we just were in the same church, but I thought, here's an occasion to wear that uniform. And so that they said, no, you don't need to wear your uniform. And I was kind of disappointed by that. And I remember once we got to church, I was really disappointed because I wanted to have that uniform on, so that maybe somehow there would be at some point in this ceremony this recognition or this invitation for others who were scouts to stand. And I just kind of had in my mind this image that me with my blue shirt with my patches and my yellow neckerchief and my brass neckerchief slide, I just kind of pictured myself like those Russian generals with all their medals. I just kind of pictured that maybe, just maybe, somehow there's going to be this occasion during the service where there might be this invitation where I could stand. Maybe that I could salute. That I could do something. But and ultimately, in the mind of this little second grader, third grader, whatever I was at that age, rooted in that desire was this: I wanted somehow, even in a small way, even for just a little bit, I wanted to get in the spotlight. I wanted some attention. I wanted some prominence. The reality is that type of desire shouldn't come as a surprise, because every single one of us is wired with that desire. We are wired to want to experience prominence. That whatever state it is that we are in, we want to be elevated a bit more. In fact, isn't that what the first temptation appealed to? To Adam and to Eve, that, you can be like God. That where you are, you can get kind of promoted. That you can experience prominence. We've been in and we're continuing this series that I'm calling It's Not About You. And what I want you to understand is that as a follower of Christ, if you have a personal relationship with the Lord, what God is interested in for you as His child, what He's interested in for you as His follower, is to use you to celebrate and to make His name great. That God is interested in using you to magnify Himself, to demonstrate His greatness, what it is that He has done. What God is not interested in doing is putting you up on a pedestal to direct more attention and prominence to you. But then again, we've got in us this desire, it's in our wiring that we want this. So here's the question: how can you as a follower of Christ fight the urge for prominence? I want you to see the answer to that question today in Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10, if you would look with me in your Bibles there today, starting with verse 35. And we're going to see some guys that in many ways are just like us. And we can look back and we can wag our fingers at them and say, well, I can't believe that you did that. But in truth, they're just like us. Mark chapter 10, verse 35, we're told this: that James and John, the sons of Zebedee, approached him, that's Jesus, and said, "Teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask of you." And Jesus said, What do you want me to do for you?" They answered, "Allow us to sit at your right hand and at your left hand in your glory." And Jesus said to them, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" "We are able," they told him. And Jesus said, "You will drink the cup I drink, and you will be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not mine to give. Instead, it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 disciples heard this, they began to be indignant with James and John. Jesus called them over and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles, they lord it over them, and those in high positions act as tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you will be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you will be slave to all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." So again, the question very simply is this: how do you as a follower of Christ fight the urge for personal prominence? We've got people struggling with this here. In fact, at this point, they're kind of failing in it. So what can we learn from them? And I believe based on what we are informed about here, there's a few truths that we need to remember. And if we remember these things, get them in our mind, let them settle into our hearts, I believe it can begin to make a difference so that we can fight the urge of making me great and focus more on making him great. So what can we do? The first thing is this: remember that spiritualizing faulty desires doesn't make them positive. Spiritualizing faulty desires does not make them positive. At this point in Mark's gospel, of course it's the shortest of the gospels, it's getting very late in the ministry of Jesus. We are near the end of the 3-year mark of Jesus' public ministry. In fact, if you just look, in fact, in my Bible on the same page, you see Mark chapter 11, it says the triumphant entry. That's Palm Sunday, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem. So we're getting ready to kick off the last week of Jesus' earthly life and ministry. And so just before then, we're we're told about this incident that occurs between Jesus and James and John. Now, James and John are a couple of the disciples, and they have known Jesus, and they've been with him effectively most waking moments for the better part of 3 years. And they know Jesus well. He is close to them. They are close to him. And they are particularly close to each other. They've known each other a lot longer than they've known Jesus because they're brothers. They've known each other their entire lives. Their father was Zebedee. They grew up in the same home. And now they come to Jesus, and it seems, based on context, that they get a moment away from the rest of the disciples to have a conversation. They want to ask Jesus something. And when they ask Jesus something, it's kind of strange. It's kind of gutsy what they ask. Notice in verse 35, they say to Jesus, "Hey, we want you to do," they don't say a little something. "Hey, could you help us with something? I've got a favor to ask of you." They say, "Psst, hey, Jesus, come here. We want you to do whatever we ask." I mean, that's essentially saying, would you get your checkbook out and just sign one down at the bottom, and we'll fill out the rest later. So whatever we ask, how about you do that? And you can tell that's a great idea, isn't it? I mean, if your kids say, "Hey, Mom, hey, Dad, I'm going to ask you something, and whatever I ask you to, I just want you to say yes to whatever it is," right? Because you know that's going to be a brilliant thing that's getting ready to follow. And so Jesus says, and he humors them and says, what do you want me to do for you? And so they answered in verse 37, "Allow us to sit at your right and your left when you come into your glory." And I imagine it's kind of hush-hush. The rest of the disciples are not that far away. They got just this morning, "Jesus, how about just one little thing? Whatever we ask, what's that? When you come into your glory, let me sit on the right and let him sit on the left." So you're in the middle, but we're right there with you. All right, now, hearing this, Jesus says to them in verse 36, "You do not know what you're asking. You have no grasp of the gravity of your request. You do not get what you're talking about." Now, what has Jesus been talking about as of late? Again, it's getting late in the ministry of Jesus, and he is preparing the disciples. These guys that have been with him for 3 years, he is getting ready to pass the baton because Jesus knows that the cross is just around the corner, and he's getting ready to leave them. And so if you go back in chapter 10, you're going to see a number of references. And Jesus has throughout his ministry, but it's getting more urgent. He's been talking about the kingdom of God. Beyond that, if you go back to chapter 9, and James and John are unique with Peter, that they have an experience that the rest of the disciples don't have. And if you go back to chapter 9, starting with verse 2, what happens is that Peter, James, and John go with Jesus up the mountain. The Spirit of God descends like a cloud on this mountain. Elijah and Moses are present, and the full deity of Jesus is made altogether clear for every one of them that is present. And Peter, James, and John, they knew that Jesus was something special before then, but now they're like, this is a whole lot bigger than I ever thought. This is a whole lot bigger than ever I thought. And as they come down the mountain, it says that Jesus told them not to say anything, and it says they kept his word to themselves, questioning what rising from the dead meant. And so Jesus has been talking about the kingdom, and they don't quite get all of that. And he's been saying that I'm going to be betrayed, that I'm going to be killed, but then I'm going to experience a resurrection. And they're like, I don't get this. I don't get this. And so it's altogether the case that Peter, James, and John, but especially James and John, it seems, they've got more questions than answers. However, there's a couple of things I believe they feel pretty certain about. And one of those is this: that Jesus is going to be leaving them at some point, and where he is going to be a place of utmost prominence. That he's going to be experiencing this position of glory and splendor that they know I can't get my arms completely around, but I know it's going to be really good. I know it's going to be good. And so, based on that, they ask a question. Jesus, how about letting us sit on your right and the left? Now, on the surface, at least perhaps quickly, you might say, well, that's not a bad thing really to ask, is it? Because you could say, and maybe it was that there's more context to this, and they implied that the rationale or the reasoning behind their request was, Jesus, we just love you so much. We just want to be right there with you. I mean, it's kind of like the hymn, Nearer My God to Thee. Jesus, we just want to be so close with you. We've been with you for 3 years, thick and thin. You're going to be leaving, and we don't know exactly about where you're going, but we know that elevator is going to the top floor. And wherever you is, we want to be just right there with you, on the right, on the left. It sounds really, really spiritual, perhaps. But is that their ultimate reason for asking this? It seems pretty clear that it's not. They are asking Jesus this question because they have the same desires that I have, that you have, that we're all wired with, and that is that we have these aspirations for some personal prominence, to get elevated in terms of stature. And so they say, Jesus, let me sit on your right and left. Why? Because those are the best seats. I mean, you've got the throne in the middle, and the closest you can, we don't want the throne, but just right there beside it. On the right, on the left. Can you go ahead and put name tags on those? James, John, right, and left. But what I believe they are attempting to do is to spiritualize what they're doing. We'll just be right there with you, just close. They're possessing desires that though they were wired with, they were out of bounds desires that would make them great, not Jesus. And even though the context or the implication behind it is that it's rooted in the desire to be close to Jesus, that's kind of spiritualizing a faulty desire. And let me just tell you, spiritualizing a faulty desire doesn't make it right, doesn't make it good, doesn't make it positive. But does that type of thing go on? Sure it does. In fact, let me give you an example of the same type of thing that has occurred that I feel sure if you've been around the church, I mean specifically Gate City, but I'll be honest with you, I've experienced what I've just described. I've experienced it here, but in truth in every other church I've ever been at as a member or pastor as well. You understand, and the Bible makes plain that gossip, we shouldn't do that, right? Shouldn't be gossiping, right? It's not good. It's not becoming. It's not what God is pleased by. It's, from God's perspective, in my life and yours, gossip is sin, all right? We should not do that. The Bible makes that pretty plain. Now, what I have witnessed, maybe you have as well, is that there have been instances, maybe it's in a Sunday school class, it's not typically necessarily in like corporate worship time in front of everybody. It tends to be a smaller group, but you'll have somebody that will share a story, that'll share some information, maybe juicy information, but it'll be shared not as gossip. This is a what? It's a prayer request. I want to pray for Sister Alice. You would not believe what she has done. Oh my goodness. Just pray for her. Just pray for her. And then you begin to spill all these details. Is there any reason that everybody needs to know that? No, unless, of course, the ultimate aim is to just share that news, to share that juicy bit of gossip, but you attempt to cloak it, to spiritualize it and say, no, this is a prayer request. But let me just tell you, whether it's sharing gossip in the form of a prayer request or attempting to cloak desires for personal prominence under spiritual terms, when we spiritualize faulty desires, they're still faulty. They're still out of bounds. They're still wrong. And the same is true in our desires for attention, for prominence, for the spotlight. And even though we may say, you know, what I just really hope is for greater opportunity to expand the possibilities for sharing and to have a bigger platform that more people might be reached. And I have heard this, likely that you've heard this type of language before, that so many times what is rooting that, motivating that, is the desire to be personally noticed, to be seen, to experience greater prominence. So how do you fix this, or how do you identify this? Let me just tell you very plainly, you and I cannot do this on our own. We have to have some help. And so you're going to need, and I'm going to need to ask God, and it needs to become part of our regular conversation with the Lord. Listen, Lord, will you help me? Because I have some desires that are going to try to make me great and not you. And I know that it's best, and what you want me to do is to try to magnify your name, not mine. And so there are some desires and there's some opportunities, and as I am experiencing these opportunities, as these things are going on, will you help me to see the truth about the motivation behind what I'm pursuing? Am I doing this because this puts me on the elevator? Because if that's the case, help me to know that, because that's not what you want. You want me to put you on the elevator and put you on the top floor to make your name great and not mine. How can we fight the urge? Well, we've got to remember that spiritualizing faulty desires does not make them right. But based on what we see here, there's another thing that we need to do, which is this. Remember that limited self-awareness prompts greater self-assessment. Limited self-awareness prompts greater self-assessment. What do I mean by that? Notice what continues to go on. In verse 38, Jesus has said to them, guys, you do not know what you're asking. And then he poses for them a question. He says, are you able to drink the cup or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? In the Old Testament, both the cup and the concept of baptism. And when we hear baptism, we tend to think water and following Jesus. But in the Old Testament, and that's what Jesus is appealing to, is that the cup and that baptism suggested being deluged by trouble and adversity. So Jesus is saying, listen, off the charts, 10 plus trouble is just around the corner, and I'm going to be experiencing this. It is a bitter cup, and it is a baptism by fire in terms of trouble and adversity like you have never even conceived of before. And it is through that being brought low that I'm going to be brought to prominence, but you want to just have it handed to you. So let me just ask you, are you able to go through what I'm getting ready to go through? And what do they say? We are able. Do you get a hint that there is any uncertainty? Well, yeah, maybe. I think so. Let me chew on that for a little bit. You know, Jesus, you're saying that. Maybe I need to pause and think about this for a little while. Maybe you're right. I don't know exactly what I'm thinking about. Do you get any of that reservation? No. What you get is glaring, full throttle, loud as it can be, personal confidence. Absolutely certain we can handle this. Jesus, just bring it on. We absolutely can experience this. Whatever it is, we're in the game, and it further underscores what Jesus said to them back in verse 38. Guys, you have no idea what it is that you are asking, what it is that you are talking about. In this, there's a very practical lesson, which I would say again is this. Limited self-awareness prompts greater self-assessment. In this case, James and John have such little self-awareness that causes their self-assessment to say, look at me. I am so big. I am so strong. I am so mighty. There's nothing that I cannot do. Why? Because their self-awareness was so very small. I was talking with someone just recently, and they were talking about this other individual that at 17 or 18 years old had gotten in a car, finished school, and just they left the house and just ready to they were ready to tackle the world. I mean, they were able to just in their mind they thought, I can do anything. It's almost like charging hell with a water pistol. I can take whatever life has to throw at me. And when we were talking, they said, that's kind of how you are at 17, isn't it? And how I describe it is this, that is a unique age, and those of you that are past that line, you can attest to this. It's amazing how at the same time you can know nothing and everything at the same time. I mean, and think back to where you were at 18 years old. Maybe you'd finished high school. It's amazing at that point, somehow you know everything. And mom, dad, teacher, preacher, friend, no one can speak any truth into you because you know everything. But isn't it strange that at the same time you know everything, you also know nothing at the same time? And it doesn't take very long, sometimes just 5 or 6 years, that you realize, you know what, mom and dad might have a thing or two that they might be able to interject. And maybe that teacher, maybe that friend, maybe that preacher, maybe that counselor, whoever it is, you know what, maybe they weren't so dumb after all. But why is it at 17, at 18, that we think that we are so smart? It's because we have such limited self-awareness. And when self-awareness is going to be on low, self-assessment is going to be on high. What's going on with with James and John is that their self-assessment, the volume is turned way down. And so they're not evaluating to say what weaknesses, what vulnerabilities, what limitations, how small is my perspective. They're not thinking about any of that. And so when there's no awareness of personal limitation, then you think you can do anything. You think you can do everything. And the more limited your self-awareness is, the less likely it is that you're going to be aware of personal limitations, and the greater your self-assessment is going to be. So what do you do with this? How do we work on this? Well, again, I've got to have some help. And if you are someone who has a relationship with Christ, part of your regular conversation needs to be, Lord, help me see how big you are. And as I see how big you are, it's going to help me see how small I am, how little I know, and how just microscopic my perspective is. And when I am the more aware I become of my limitations, the less big I think myself to be, the less great I personally aspire to be, the more successful I can be in fighting the urge for personal prominence. Last thing I would say to you based on what we see here is this. Advancing personal stature. We've got to remember this. Advancing personal stature will adversely affect personal relationships. Advancing your personal stature will always, always, always adversely affect your personal relationships. I said that James and John have this conversation with Jesus, and it seems that they kind of pulled him off to the side. But the rest of the disciples aren't very far away, because by the time you get to verse 41, it says, when the 10 disciples heard this, so somebody's like, what's going on over there? What did you say? What did you say? And so when they hear this, what does it say? It says that they are indignant with James and John. And even if they didn't say it, what's the thought? Who do they think they are? Well, you've been with Jesus 3 years. Well, I've been with Jesus 3 years. You left everything to follow Jesus. I left everything to follow Jesus. The right and left next to the throne of God. Are you serious? What what is the matter with you, you arrogant cuss? I cannot believe this. I mean, I don't think there's a hat big enough to go on your ginormous head. I mean, I think sitting on your shoulders is a hot air balloon. What is the matter with you? They are indignant. When you're indignant, what does that mean? There is this sense that you have been wrong, that you have been treated unjustly or unfairly. And have they been? Absolutely. Because you got James and John saying, hey, don't give this to everyone, just to us, right and left. James, John, or just if you just want to put J. One. And the disciples are like, the rest of them are like, what are you thinking? Are you crazy? Now, when that happens, these are guys that have been together for 3 years. And sometimes, and you've experienced this before, you might have gone to camp with somebody that was a stranger to you. But going to camp and spending a week together, somehow just that shared experience, you feel so close. Or maybe it's a mission trip. You've gone, you've left home, you've been somewhere, a foreign country or a distant location, whatever it is. And just that shared experience. Or some of you guys that have been on a tour of duty, serving your country somewhere, you get so close to those people. James and John are so close with the rest of the disciples, but now this has kind of thrown a monkey wrench into the works. Things going forward, they're going to be different. They're going to be different. Now, listen, I believe that the expectation of God on us, for us, is that we forgive each other. And I believe it should be the case, and hopefully was the case, certainly, that the rest of the disciples forgive James and John for this infraction. But God is able to do something that I am not able to do, that you're not able to do, which is to completely put something out of your active thought. The rest of the disciples couldn't unhear what they had heard. They couldn't unknow what they knew. And going forward, it's entirely possible, if not in fact likely, that every time James and John did something, even if the others didn't say it, even if they didn't voice it to anybody else, there was this thought, I wonder if they're doing this because they're trying to get to the head of the line again. I mean, are they doing this because their heart's right or because their head's big? What I'm saying to you very simply is this. When you and I seek to advance our personal stature, we need to make sure that we guard against that, because it always, in every relationship that we have, every one of them, it adversely affects them. It causes them harm, and things will never, ever be exactly the same as they were in the absence of it. So if you want to guard against this, bear in mind, ask yourself, ask God to help you remember. Listen, Lord, if I try to elevate my stature, it's going to hurt my relationships with other people, and I don't want to do that. Instead of seeking to gain prominence by achieving position, Jesus says that greatness comes very differently. Very differently. You know, there are a few times that I've had to drive a vehicle that's got a trailer on it. And every time I have pulled a vehicle with a trailer, I have been very intentional and very selective and very careful in where it is that I stop, more specifically where it is that I park. Why? Because I cannot back a trailer. You ever try to do that? You ought to. We'll go hook up the van afterwards. You can have fun. Hook the trailer up to it. Anyway, the difficulty with backing a trailer is that everything works in reverse. So if you want the trailer to go that way, you need to turn the wheels opposite of what you would normally do. You want to go right, you need to turn the wheels left. And so the back of the van is going to go this way, the trailer is going to go in the opposite direction. And it requires so much thought. I mean, for me, I could do a calculus equation better, I think, than I could back a trailer. And so I'm so very careful because it is so backwards. It is so backwards. And when you look at what Jesus says here, he says, whoever wants to become great among you will be your servant. Whoever wants to become first of all will become a slave to all. That's backwards logic, isn't it? That greatness comes by lowering. That prominence comes by service. In fact, then Jesus says, that's exactly how I do it. That's how I operate. But it is so counterintuitive. It is so backwards. Now, understand this, that what Jesus says here can promote or prompt a temptation. And the temptation could be, I really would like the spotlight. I'm kind of wired to want that. I'd like some prominence. So Jesus said that if I serve, I can get prominence. That by helping other people, that I can get great by doing that. Let me just tell you that if that is the motivation for service, greatness never comes. It's like if that's what you're seeking, you will never, ever find it. And so ultimately, Jesus' words are an encouragement to look for something different, to seek something altogether the opposite. Instead of seeking and pursuing greatness, decide, you know what? It's not all about me. What I ought to do as a follower of Jesus is to follow his example and intentionally and have as my ultimate motivation serving others. And when that happens, God blesses it. And greatness may very well come. That God blesses that, not as a means of demonstrating your greatness, but as a means of demonstrating his greatness through you. So here's the question. Every one of us has the urge for the spotlight, to be on center stage, to have attention, to have prominence. But understand, God's not interested in making you great. He's interested in using you to magnify his greatness. Are you serious about wanting to fight the urge against your personal prominence? Will you bow your heads with me?